Chapter 19 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 19. After 5 years. The quiet days grew into weeks and months, and even years, without any event to startle the little circle into the consciousness of the lapse of time. One who had known them at the date of Ruth's becoming a governess in Mr. Bradshaw's family, and had been absent until the time of which I am now going to tell you, would have noted some changes which had imperceptibly come over all. But he, too, would have thought that the life which had brought so little of turmoil and vicissitude must have been calm and tranquil, and in accordance with the bygone activity of the town in which their existence passed away. The alterations that he would have perceived were those caused by the natural progress of time. The Benson home was brightened into vividness by the presence of the little Leonard, now a noble boy of 6, large and grand in limb and stature, and with a face of marked beauty and intelligence. Indeed, he might have been considered by many as too intelligent for his years, and often the living with old and thoughtful people gave him, beyond most children, the appearance of pondering over the mysteries which meet the young on the threshold of life, but which fade away as advancing years bring us more into contact with the practical and tangible, fade away and vanish, until it seems to require the agitation of some great storm of the soul before we can again realize spiritual things. But at times Leonard seemed oppressed and bewildered, after listening intent, with grave and wondering eyes, to the conversation around him. At others, the bright animal life shone forth radiant, and no 3 months' kitten, no foal, suddenly tossing up its heels by the side of its sedate dam, and careering around the pasture in pure mad enjoyment, no young creature of any kind could show more merriment and gladness of heart. "Forever in mischief" was Sally's account of him at such times, but it was not intentional mischief, and Sally herself would have been the first to scold any one else who had used the same words in reference to her darling. Indeed, she was once nearly giving warning because she thought the boy was being ill-used. The occasion was this. Leonard had for some time shown a strange, odd disregard of truth. He invented stories, and told them with so grave a face, that unless there was some internal evidence of their incorrectness, such as describing a cow with a bonnet on, he was generally believed, and his statements, which were given with the full appearance of relating a real occurrence, had once or twice led to awkward results. All the 3, whose hearts were pained by this apparent unconsciousness of the difference between truth and falsehood, were unaccustomed to children, or they would have recognized this as a stage through which most infants, who would have lively imaginations, pass, and accordingly there was a consultation in Mr. Benson's study one morning. Ruth was there, quiet, very pale, and with compressed lips, sick at heart as she heard Miss Benson's arguments for the necessity of whipping, in order to cure Leonard of his story-telling. Mr. Benson looked happy and uncomfortable. Education was but a series of experiments to them all, and they all had a secret dread of spoiling the noble boy, who was the darling of their hearts. And, perhaps, this very intensity of love begot an impatient, unnecessary anxiety, and made them resolve on sterner measures than the parent of a large family, where love was more spread abroad, would have dared to use. At any rate, the vote for whipping carried the day, and even Ruth, trembling and cold, agreed that it must be done. Only she asked, in a meek, sad voice, if she need be present. Mr. Benson was to be the executioner, the scene the study, and being instantly told that she had better not, she went slowly and languidly up to her room, and kneeling down, she closed her ears and prayed. Miss Benson, having carried her point, was very sorry for the child, and would have begged him off, but Mr. Benson had listened more to her arguments than now to her pleadings, and only answered, "If it is right, it shall be done." He went into the garden, and deliberately, almost as if he wished to gain time, chose and cut off a little switch from the laburnum tree. Then he returned through the kitchen, and gravely taking the awed and wondering little fellow by the hand, he led him silently into the study, and placing him before him, began an admonition on the importance of truthfulness, meaning to conclude with what he believed to be the moral of all punishment. "As you cannot remember this of yourself, I must give you a little pain to make you remember it. I am sorry it is necessary, and that you cannot recollect without my doing so." But before he had reached this very proper and desirable conclusion, and while he was yet working his way, his heart ached with the terrified look of the child at the solemnly sad face and words of upbraiding. Sally burst in. "And what may ye be going to do with that fine switch I saw ye gathering, Master Thurstan?" asked she, her eyes gleaming with anger at the answer she knew must come, if answer she had at all. "Go away, Sally," said Mr. Benson, annoyed at the fresh difficulty in his path. "I'll not stir never a step till you give me that switch, as you've got for some mischief, I'll be bound." "Sally, remember where it is said, 'He that spareth the rod spoileth the child,'" said Mr. Benson, austerely. "Ay, I remember, and I remember a bit more than you want me to remember, I reckon. It were King Solomon as spoke them words, and it were King Solomon's son that were King Rehoboam, and no great shakes either. I can remember what is said on him, 2 Chronicles 12, chapter 14th verse, and he, that's King Rehoboam, the lad that tasted the rod, did evil, because he prepared not his heart to seek the Lord. I've not been reading my chapters every night for 50 years to be caught napping by a dissenter, neither," said she triumphantly. "Come along, Leonard." She stretched out her hand to the child, thinking that she had conquered. But Leonard did not stir. He looked wistfully at Mr. Benson. "Come," said she impatiently. The boy's mouth quivered. "If you want to whip me, uncle, you may do it. I don't much mind." Put in this form, it was impossible to carry out his intentions, and so Mr. Benson told the lad he might go, that he would speak to him another time. Leonard went away, more subdued in spirit than if he had been whipped. Sally lingered a moment. She stopped to add, "I think it's for them without sin to throw stones at a poor child, and cut up good laburnum branches to whip him. I only do as my betters do, when I call Leonard's mother Mrs. Denbigh." The moment she had said this she was sorry. It was an ungenerous advantage after the enemy had acknowledged himself defeated. Mr. Benson dropped his head upon his hands, and bid his face, and sighed deeply. Leonard flew in search of his mother, as in search of a refuge. If he had found her calm, he would have burst into a passion of crying after his agitation. As it was, he came upon her kneeling and sobbing, and he stood quite still. Then he threw his arms round her neck, and said, "Mamma, mamma, I will be good. I make a promise. I will speak true. I make a promise." And he kept his word. Miss Benson piqued herself upon being less carried away by her love for this child than anyone else in the house. She talked severely, and had capital theories, but her severity ended in talk, and her theories would not work. However, she read several books on education, knitting socks for Leonard all the while, and, upon the whole, I think the hands were more usefully employed than the head, and the good honest heart better than either. She looked older than when we first knew her, but it was a ripe, kindly age that was coming over her. Her excellent practical sense, perhaps, made her a more masculine character than her brother. He was often so much perplexed by the problems of life that he let the time for action go by, but she kept him in check by her clear, pithy talk, which brought back his wandering thoughts to the duty that lay straight before him, waiting for action. And then he remembered that it was the faithful part to wait patiently upon God, and leave the ends in His hands, who alone knows why evil exists in this world, and why it ever hovers on either side of good. In this respect, Miss Benson had more faith than her brother, or so it seemed, for quick, resolute action in the next step of life was all she required, while he deliberated and trembled, and often did wrong from his very deliberation, when his first instinct would have led him right. But, although decided and prompt as ever, Miss Benson was grown older since the summer afternoon when she dismounted from the coach at the foot of the long Welsh hill that led to Llandew, where her brother awaited her to consult her about Ruth. Though her eye was as bright and straight-looking as ever, quick and brave in its glances, her hair had become almost snowy white, and it was on this point she consulted Sally, soon after the date of Leonard's last untruth. The two were arranging Miss Benson's room one morning, when, after dusting the looking-glass, she suddenly stopped in her operation, and, after a close inspection of herself, startled Sally by this speech: "Sally, I'm looking a great deal older than I used to." Sally, who was busy dilating on the increased price of flour, considered this remark of Miss Benson's as strangely irrelevant to the matter in hand, and only noticed it by a "To be sure, I suppose we all on us do, but 2 and 4 pence a dozen is too much to make us pay for it." Miss Benson went on with her inspection of herself, and Sally with her economical projects. "Sally," said Miss Benson, "my hair is nearly white. The last time I looked it was only pepper and salt. What must I do?" Why, what would the wench do?" asked Sally contemptuously. "You're never going to be taken in at your time of life by hair dyes and such gimcracks as can only take in young girls whose wisdom teeth are not cut." "And who are not very likely to want them," said Miss Benson quietly. "No, but you see, Sally, it's very awkward having such grey hair, and feeling so young. Do you know, Sally, I've as great a mind for dancing, when I hear a lively tune on the street organs, as ever, and as great a mind to sing when I'm happy, to sing in my old way, Sally, you know." "Aye, you had it from a girl," said Sally, "and many a time when the door's been shut, I did not know if it was you in the parlour or a big bumblebee in the kitchen as was making that drumbling noise. I heard you at it yesterday." "But an old woman with grey hair ought not to have a fancy for dancing or singing," continued Miss Benson. "What nonsense are you talking?" said Sally, roused to indignation. "Calling yourself an old woman when you're better than 10 years younger than me, and many a girl has grey hair at 25. "But I'm more than 25, Sally. I'm 57 next May." "More shame for ye, then, not to know better than to talk of dyeing your hair. I cannot abide such vanities." "Oh, dear Sally, when will you understand what I mean? I want to know how I'm to keep remembering how old I am, so as to prevent myself from feeling so young. I was quite startled just now to see my hair in the glass, for I can generally tell if my cap is straight by feeling. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll cut off a piece of my grey hair, and plait it together for a marker in my Bible." Miss Benson expected applause for this bright idea, but Sally only made answer, "You'll be taking to painting your cheeks next, now you've once thought of dyeing your hair." So Miss Benson plaited her grey hair in silence and quietness, Leonard holding one end of it while she wove it, and admiring the colour and texture all the time, with a sort of implied dissatisfaction at the auburn colour of his own curls, which was only half comforted away by Miss Benson's information that he lived long enough his hair would be like hers. Mr. Benson, who had looked old and frail while he was yet but young, was now stationary as to the date of his appearance, but there was something more of nervous restlessness in his voice and ways than formerly. That was the only change 5 years had brought to him. And as for Sally, she chose to forget age in the passage of years altogether, and had as much work in her, to use her own expression, as she had at 16. Nor was her appearance very explicit as to the flight of time. 50, 60, or 70 she might be, not more than the last nor less than the first, though her usual answer to any circuitous inquiry as to her age was now, what it had been for many years past, "I'm feared I shall never see 30 again." Then, as to the house, it was not one where the sitting rooms are refurnished every 2 or 3 years, not now even, since Ruth came to share their living, a place where, as an article grew shabby or worn, a new one was purchased. The furniture looked poor, and the carpets almost threadbare, but there was such a dainty spirit of cleanliness abroad, such exquisite neatness of repair, and altogether so bright and cheerful a look about the rooms, everything so above board, no shifts to conceal poverty under flimsy ornament, that many a splendid drawing-room would give less pleasure to those who could see evidence of character in inanimate things. But whatever poverty there might be in the house, there was full luxuriance in the little square, wall-encircled garden, on 2 sides of which the parlour and kitchen looked. The laburnum tree, which when Ruth came was like a twig stuck into the ground, was now a golden glory in spring, and a pleasant shade in summer. The wild hop that Mr. Benson had brought home from one of his country rambles, and planted by the parlour window while Leonard was yet a baby in his mother's arms, was now a garland over the casement, hanging down long tendrils that waved in the breezes, and threw pleasant shadows and traceries, like some old bacchanalian carving, on the parlour walls, at morn or dusky eve. The yellow rose had clambered up to the window of Mr. Benson's bedroom, and its blossom-laden branches were supported by a jargonelle pear-tree rich in autumnal fruit. But perhaps in Ruth herself there was the greatest external change, for of the change which had gone on in her heart and mind and soul, or if there had been any, neither she or anyone around her was conscious. But sometimes Miss Benson did say to Sally, "How very handsome Ruth is grown!" to which Sally made ungracious answer, "Yes, she's well enough. Beauty is deceitful, and favour a snare, and I'm thankful the Lord has spared me from such man-traps and spring guns." But even Sally could not help secretly admiring Ruth. If her early brilliancy of colouring was gone, a clear ivory skin as smooth as satin told of complete and perfect health, and was as lovely, if not so striking in effect, as the banished lilies and roses. Her hair had grown darker and deeper in the shadow that lingered in its masses. Her eyes, even if you had guessed that they had shed bitter tears in their day, had a thoughtful, spiritual look about them that made you wonder at their depth, and look again. The increase of dignity in her face had been imparted to her form. I do not know if she had grown taller since the birth of her child, but she looked as if she had, and although she had lived in a very humble home, yet there was something about either it or her, or the people amongst whom she had been thrown during the last few years, which had so changed her, that whereas 6 or 7 years ago you would have perceived that she was not altogether a lady by birth and education, yet now she might have been placed among the highest in the land, and would have been taken by the most critical judge for their equal, although ignorant of their conventional etiquette, an ignorance which she would have acknowledged in a simple childlike way, being unconscious of any false shame. Her whole heart was in her boy. She often feared that she loved him too much, more than God himself, yet she could not bear to pray to have her love for her child lessened, but she would kneel down by his little bed at night, at the deep, still midnight, with the stars that kept watch over Rizpah shining down upon her, and tell God what I have now told you, that she feared and loved her child too much, yet could not, would not, love him less, and speak to him of her one treasure as she could speak to no earthly friend. And so, unconsciously, her love of her child led her up to love to God, to the all-knowing, who read her heart. It might be superstition, I dare say it was, but somehow she never lay down to rest without saying, as she looked her last on her boy, "Thy will, not mine, be done." And even while she trembled and shrank with infinite dread from sounding the depths of what that will might be, she felt as if her treasure were more secure to waken up rosy and bright in the morning, as one over whose slumbers God's holy angels had watched, for the very words which she had turned away in sick terror from realizing the night before. Her daily absence at her duties to the Bradshaw children only ministered to her love for Leonard. Everything does minister to love when its foundation lies deep in a true heart, and it was with exquisite pang of delight that, after a moment of vague fear, "Oh, mercy to myself," I said, "if Lucy should be dead," she saw her child's bright face of welcome as he threw open the door every afternoon on her return home. For it was his silently appointed work to listen for her knock and rush breathless to let her in. If he were in the garden or upstairs among the treasures of the lumber room, either Miss Benson or her brother or Sally would fetch him to his happy little task. No one so sacred as he to the allotted duty. And the joyous meeting was not deadened by custom to either mother or child. Ruth gave the Bradshaws the highest satisfaction, as Mr. Bradshaw often said both to her and to the Bensons. Indeed, she rather winced under his pompous approbation. But his favourite recreation was patronising, and when Ruth saw how quietly and meekly Mr. Benson submitted to gifts and praise, when an honest word of affection or a tacit implied acknowledgment of equality would have been worth everything said and done, she tried to be more meek in spirit, and to recognise the good that undoubtedly existed in Mr. Bradshaw. He was richer and more prosperous than ever, a keen, far-seeing man of business, with an undisguised contempt for all who failed in the success which he had achieved. But it was not alone those who were less fortunate in obtaining wealth than himself that he visited with severity of judgment. Every moral error or delinquency came under his unsparing comment. Stained by no vice himself, either in his own eyes or in that of any human being who cared to judge him. Having nicely and wisely proportioned and adapted his means to his ends, he could afford to speak and act with a severity which was almost sanctimonious in its ostentation or thankfulness as to himself. Not a misfortune or a sin was brought to light, but Mr. Bradshaw could trace to its cause in some former mode of action, which he long ago foretold would lead to shame. If another's son turned out wild or bad, Mr. Bradshaw had little sympathy. It might have been prevented by a stricter rule, or more religious life at home. Young Richard Bradshaw was quiet and steady, and other fathers might have had sons like him if they had taken the same pains to enforce obedience. Richard was an only son, and yet Mr. Bradshaw might venture to say he had never had his own way in his life. Mrs. Bradshaw was, he confessed. Mr. Bradshaw did not like confessing his wife's errors. Rather less firm than he should have liked with the girls, and with some people, he believed, Jemima was rather headstrong, but to his wishes she had always shown herself obedient. All children were obedient if their parents were decided and authoritative, and every one would turn out well, if properly managed. If they did not prove good, then they might take the consequences of their errors. Mrs. Bradshaw murmured faintly at her husband when his back was turned, but if his voice was heard, or his footsteps sounded in the distance, she was mute, and hurried her children into the attitude or action most pleasing to their father. Jemima, it is true, rebelled against this manner of proceeding, which savoured to her a little of deceit, but even she had not, as yet, overcome her awe of her father sufficiently to act independently of him, and according to her own sense of right, or rather, I should say, according to her own warm, passionate impulses. Before him, the wilfulness which made her dark eyes blaze out at times was hushed and still. He had no idea of her self-tormenting, no notion of the almost southern jealousy which seemed to belong to her brunette complexion. Jemima was not pretty. The flatness and shortness of her face made her almost plain. Yet most people looked twice at her expressive countenance, at the eyes which flamed or melted at every trifle, at the rich colour which came at every expressed emotion into her usually sallow face, at the faultless teeth which made her smile like a sunbeam. But then, again, when she thought she was not kindly treated, when a suspicion crossed her mind, or when she was angry with herself, her lips were tight pressed together, her colour was wan and almost livid, and a stormy gloom clouded her eyes as with a film. But before her father her words were few, and he did not notice looks or tones. Her brother Richard had been equally silent before his father in boyhood and early youth, but since he had gone to be a clerk in a London house, preparatory to assuming his place as junior partner in Mr. Bradshaw's business, he spoke more on his occasional visits at home, and very proper and highly moral was his conversation, sentences of goodness, which were like the flowers that children stick in the ground, and that have not sprung upwards from roots, deep down in the hidden life and experience of the heart. He was as severe a judge as his father of other people's conduct, but you felt that Mr. Bradshaw was sincere in his condemnation of all outward error and vice, and that he would try himself by the same laws as he tried others. Somehow Richard's words were frequently heard with a lurking distrust, and many shook their heads over the patterned son. But then it was those whose sons had gone astray and had been condemned in no private or tender manner by Mr. Bradshaw, so it might be revenge in them. Still, Jemima felt that all was not right. Her heart sympathized in the rebellion against his father's commands, which her brother had confessed to her in an unusual moment of confidence. But her uneasy conscience condemned the deceit which he had practised. The brother and sister were sitting alone over a blazing Christmas fire, and Jemima held an old newspaper in her hand to shield her face from the hot light. They were talking of family events, when, during a pause, Jemima's eye caught the name of a great actor who had lately given prominence and life to a character in one of Shakespeare's plays. The criticism in the paper was fine, and warmed Jemima's heart. "How I should like to see a play!" exclaimed she. "Should you?" said her brother listlessly. "Yes, to be sure. Just hear this." And she began to read a fine passage of criticism. "Those newspaper people can make an article out of anything," said he, yawning. "I've seen the man myself, and it was all very well, but nothing to make such a fuss about." "Have you seen a play, Richard? Oh, why did you never tell me before? Tell me all about it. Why did you never name seeing in your letters?" He half smiled, contemptuously enough. "Oh, at first it strikes one rather, but after a while one cares no more for the theatre than one does for mince pies." "Oh, I wish I might go to London," said Jemima impatiently. "I've a great mind to ask papa to let me go to the George Smiths, and then I could see. I would not think him like mince pies." "You must not do any such thing," said Richard, now neither yawning nor contemptuous. "My father would never allow you to go to the theatre, and the George Smiths are such old fogies. They would be sure to tell." "How do you go, then? Does my father give you leave?" "Oh, many things are right for men which are not for girls." Jemima sat and pondered. Richard wished he had not been so confidential. "You need not name it," said he, rather anxiously. "Name what?" said she, startled, for her thoughts had gone far afield. "Oh, name my going once or twice to the theatre." "No, I shan't name it," said she. "No one here would care to hear it." But it was with some little surprise, and almost with a feeling of disgust, that she heard Richard join with her father in condemning someone, and add to Mr Bradshaw's list of offences by alleging that the young man was a playgoer. He did not think his sister heard his words. Mary and Elizabeth were the two girls whom Ruth had in charge. They resembled Jemima more than their brother in character. The household rules were occasionally a little relaxed in their favour, for Mary, the elder, was nearly 8 years younger than Jemima, and 3 intermediate children had died. They loved Ruth dearly, made a great pet of Leonard, and had many profound secrets together, most of which related to their wonders if Jemima and Mr Farquhar would ever be married. They watched their sister closely, and every day had some fresh confidence to make to each other, confirming or discouraging to their hopes. Ruth rose early, and shared the household work with Sally and Miss Benson till 7, and then she helped Leonard to dress, and had a quiet time alone with him till prayers and breakfast. At 9 she was to be at Mr Bradshaw's house. She sat in the room with Mary and Elizabeth during the Latin, the writing, and the arithmetic lessons which they received from masters. Then she read, and walked with them, clinging to her as to an elder sister. She dined with her pupils at the family lunch, and reached home by 4. That happy home, those quiet days. And so the peaceful days passed on into weeks, and months, and years, and Ruth and Leonard grew and strengthened into the riper beauty of their respective ages, while as yet no touch of decay had come on the quaint, primitive elders of the household. End of chapter 19.